Welcome back to the Environmental Law Monitor. I'm your host, Daniel Pope. This podcast is brought to you by Bracewell, LLP. Maybe you've heard of the retweet, the repost. Well, we're doing something similar with a podcast that I was on. Bracewell has a Data Center Counsel podcast that Jared Berg and Brian Clark, two of our colleagues here in Texas, have been leading, and they've got some great episodes out. I encourage you guys to check it out if you're interested at all in the data center revolution as it affects so much of what's going on, everything that we hear about AI. Data centers are key to that, and developing data centers are a huge aspect of the shift and the adoption of artificial intelligence tools. I said this is a kind of a retweet podcast because Jason Hutt, our fearless leader in our practice group, and yours truly joined Jared Berg at the Data Center Counsel podcast to discuss an important topic that affects some brownfield siting considerations. Brownfields have a number of advantages for data centers, including access to infrastructure, usually some kind of connection or proximity to power corridors, but brownfields can also have some liability. So we spoke with Jared about how data center developers can go into evaluating a brownfield site with their eyes open. So hope you enjoy this episode. Stay tuned, and we will talk with you soon.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Data Center Counsel podcast. Happy to have you with us again today. My name is Jared Berg, your trusty host and data center nerd, as we refer to each other now. And today I've got Jason Hutt and Daniel Pope from our environmental team here with me. Jason, Daniel, y'all want to introduce yourselves?
Sure, Jared. Thanks for having us on. I'm Jason Hutt. I'm the chair of the Environment, Lands, and Resources practice at Bracewell. I've been here for a minute now, since 1998, started as a summer associate in 97, and my whole practice is focused on environment, lands, and resources issues, but I think in particular helping clients to develop major pieces of infrastructure in the United States, and certainly data centers has been a big piece of that. Also because of really the focus of a data center is speed to power generation, and that's been sort of in the DNA of Bracewell for a long, long time.
Yep, and definitely something that we've been focusing a lot on during this podcast. So, Daniel.
Thanks for having us on, Jared. My name's Daniel Pope. I sit in our Austin office where I'm counsel in our Environment, Lands, and Resources group, and work a lot with Jason on transactional matters, enforcement matters. But I suspect we have something in common, Jared, which is that we both have been paying attention to data center developments and what it means, especially in the state of Texas. And so that's been really top of mind for me, and I've been really digging into that. And, as a longtime podcast host, this is the first time I've been a guest. So thanks for having us on.
For those who are just tuning in for this episode the first time, I'm Jared Berg, and I'm a partner in our Houston office, sitting in our corporate and energy projects groups, and have been very heavily involved, nerding out on all things data center development. So with that, today, our topic is really talking about the bleeding edge of current development in the data center arena, particularly with respect to brownfield development. So I think maybe to kick us off here, when developers are thinking about siting a new data center, I wouldn't normally think about, going to a brownfield site. Maybe you can tell us, what is a brownfield site? What is appealing to, current data center developers? Jason, Daniel, what are we talking about here?
So just to quickly level set everyone, environmental law casts a broad net of responsibility on anyone who is an owner or operator of a piece of property for the release of a hazardous substance that occurs at that property. And that includes the current and former owners and operators of that property. So if a site has been impacted from industrial activities over decades, future owners and operators are often reticent to become owners and operators of that particular property because they don't want to step into the net of responsibility for what they would view as being legacy issues associated with the site, particularly if the insolvency of those actors is in question. So the brownfield concept was to, if you went through a certain set of steps at the federal or state level, that you could inoculate yourself from being pulled into that net of potentially responsible parties by doing certain steps to inform yourself on the way into the property about what the risks are at that property, and then being sure that you put in place steps that ensure that your activities at the property do not contribute to or exacerbate the situation associated with those legacy activities. That's sort of my layman's definition. I don't know if Daniel, you would add to that, but that's kind of the basic level set that we all have to start from. Like, what is a brownfield and why might we be interested in it?
Yeah, I think the thing that I jumped to, like right after sketching out the sort of universal definition, is that these brownfield sites, because they've been used before, can have really interesting facts. And so there are no two brownfields that are really alike. And we'll be talking about what that means for redevelopment and the steps you want to take when getting acclimated with a particular location and thinking about a project.
And it turns out that someone cited this industrial activity in a place that has access to power or to the grid, one way or the other, either because they generated power at that site or because they were a massive consumer of power at that site. And they have access to water because they had to cool whatever process they were running. So suddenly it starts to fit the profile of what a data center developer is looking for, except for the legacy contamination issues to the extent they're there.
So when we're talking about, understand that we're talking about like legacy industrial sites, but, just to put names to it, like, are we talking about things like old steel mills or aluminum smelting sites or things like old mines, or is it really just anywhere where there was old industrial activity and there was a lot of water and a lot of power? Just kind of curious, putting an actual physical, idea in folks' minds as to what we're talking about.
I think the answer to your question, Jared, is yes. It can include all those things.
Yeah, maybe not the mines as much, because you have subsidence issues associated with the mines. And for a data center, you want to have a concrete pad basically that has tremendous stability for a long period of time.
Right.
But certainly your example of smelter is a very good one. It could also be a power generating facility. So an old coal-fired power plant can be a really good example, because a coal-fired power plant has the grid infrastructure. It used to be to send power to the grid, but in this case, it may be a taker.
Right.
The steel mill is a great example because it was a significant taker of energy. Same with a smelter. So they may have energy management agreements or other things like that would position a future, a data center developer to take advantage of that agreement, depending upon the jurisdiction.
When we talk about like contamination on the site, is that always a given? Is that part of the nature of large industrial activity? There's going to be some kind of contamination on the site, or are we talking about kind of a subset of industrial sites where you may be dealing with this and there's a way to get out of the liability, as you were talking about?
I think you have to manage the liabilities that exist at the sites. Like if you have an old coal-fired power plant, you may have had coal ash disposal at the site or adjacent to it. So I don't know that people would necessarily call that contamination, but there's a decommissioning liability associated with it. If you have an old steel mill, many of them were constructed in a period where asbestos-containing materials were popularly used to deal with high heat environments. And so if you have to take down that infrastructure, you're going to have to deal with the laws and liabilities associated with those activities. A lot of these, if you have significant electricity flowing in or out of a facility, you have to have transformers to manage the flow of those electrons. And those transformers were put in an era where PCB containing fluids were used to manage the heat associated with those transformers. And so PCB impacts can be a consideration. So there's a whole myriad of things that are questions that you have going into the process of deciding whether the developability of the site is there in terms of the conditions that are present at the site, and how will your presence at the site impact those conditions.
And so when you say like, how will your presence impact those conditions? I imagine, if you're taking over an old steel mill, maybe, some of it has been decommissioned, but you still have this old building. I guess, what risks are you thinking about? What are you trying to contain or address as part of the process? And, you were mentioning that there are certain steps that you can take to, I guess, maybe not be excluded as a potentially responsible party, but, have some mitigation effects. What exactly does that kind of look like?
So the good news is you're just trying to build a concrete slab to sit on top of the land. And so in many cases, you can, by doing so, encapsulate into some extent whatever it is, the risk that sits below it. The bad news is you're trying to build really big rectangles. And so you can't, to use a popular word right now, gerrymander your way around whatever the areas are that you're trying to avoid, right? Like avoidance is a strategy in the environmental liability world. So if you had an area of the site that, is less desirable to build in, a lot of people who are redeveloping the site would just be like, well, we're just not going to go in that area. But if you're trying to build giant rectangles, it becomes harder to sort of manipulate those figures around the site and find the land that's suitable for what it is that you're trying to develop. So it has benefits, but it has challenges associated with it. Yeah.
One of the reasons you're looking at brownfields in the first place is that it does have some attractive features, access to power, access to infrastructure, right? And so you want to build the biggest thing there, the biggest box you can. And so understanding site history, conducting the kind of due diligence, wherever you are in the stage of considering a potential brownfield site for a data center project, trying to familiarize yourself with that site as much as is humanly possible is step number one.
So when you, and by the way, I love the idea we're trying to build giant rectangles. That's a great, I haven't heard that before.
Sorry, I'm oversimplifying it. It's much harder to do than that sounds, but we're building big rectangles. So.
Filled with very hot, small rectangles.
I'm gonna have to use that in the future. That is great. So when you talk about diligence, Daniel, how do you think differently about environmental due diligence on a brownfield site relative to something that would be like a greenfield site in the middle of a field where there's been no previous industrial activity, just crop growing or what have you?
I think when it comes to brownfields, what I compare the diligence exercise to is a little bit more what we think of as in the transactional setting where you have already entered into some kind of arrangement with a landowner who's eager to sell a property or sell a facility. There you have some kind of connection and you can submit requests, ask questions, interview employees or owners. When it comes to what we're talking about here, which is, evaluating a brownfield site, obviously if you can do all of the steps you'd normally do in a transaction, that would be great. But I think it starts even earlier in leveraging state and federal databases to figure out what kinds of activities have been performed in that area, just to start to familiarize yourself with the character of that industrial area. And then as you get closer to redevelopment, you've got your phase one tools, which is going to involve, technical consultants performing that in a really granular fashion. Phase two, environmental site assessments, where you're actually going out and sampling groundwater or soil or other media for potential impacts. And when you're trying to account for liabilities that may be environmental liabilities that may be present at the site, you've got your known knowns, some known unknowns, some categories of risks where you're not really sure what's in there, and maybe there's something, maybe there's nothing, but you can at least describe the category. And then you've got unknown unknowns, and you're trying to figure out as many of those as you possibly can. And so because the results of the diligence affect your plan to move forward with a brownfield redevelopment, affect the design of your data center, and those to me seem like those are all considerations from the get-go of a potential project, right? The sooner you can start to wrap your arms around a site, the better.
It's also like you asked about the difference between greenfield and brownfield. So from a developability standpoint, a lot of brownfields are going to be in an industrially dense place. They're not going to be out in the middle of nowhere. And you're going to have several inputs and outputs to that site that you have to secure to generate the power, get the fuel source to the site. And you have to do that in a complex maze of a river and some other adjacent industrial sites and everything else. So you really need to think about where's my water going to come from? If it's natural gas fired, turbines, where's my natural gas going to come from? How do I tie into those things? How do I get my power from the grid to the grid? If, do I have to have battery storage? Where are the batteries going to go? So at a brownfield site, there are added complexities associated with the same things you're going to ask at a greenfield site, which I know you're seeing too, Jared, is where's the water going to come from? It's a huge question. And what sort of water cooling system are you going to put into the data center? And how are you going to explain that to the community who's going to express concerns about what is your effect on the electricity prices? What is your effect on water usage? All of these are, stakeholder considerations that our industrial clients have faced for years. But if you are at a brownfield site, you already have a community that is engaged and thinking about the impact of that site, that piece of land on their community. And so you're going to have organized community, citizens groups and things like that, and politicians who know about the site. And you're going to have to explain, what is your impact going to be, positive and also, what are the potential negatives and how will that impact the people that live in the community?
Yeah, it sounds like all of this is really kind of getting at its core to whether or not a project is viable. And that's, of course, why you always do diligence. But in this case, I think that what you guys are pointing out is that when you do typical environmental diligence at like a greenfield site, maybe it's a phase one, maybe a little bit less intensive because there isn't, historical activity there. But when you're talking about a brownfield, it almost gets down into the level of, how are you going to site the facility around without disturbing certain contaminated areas if you know about them, or disturbing areas that it's a known unknown. We don't know what's here, but we know that something might be there kind of thing, and then when you're talking about usage of the property that you've actually acquired, where does everything go? Considering all the different elements of a data center that kind of, is required.
And you have to think through the pros and cons of insisting upon and conducting sampling at a site, because environmental law generally allows you to manage the presence of contamination at your site, provided that you don't present a migration risk, that it's not migrating off of the site, and provided that the presence of that contamination doesn't pose a risk to those who come to the site. Right. So there's a human health factor of the invitees to the site. And then there's the human health factor and the environmental factor of, well, what happens if it leaves here?
Yeah.
But if you manage those two things, the contamination can be present for significant periods of time.
Yeah. Something you mentioned, Jason, that I think is also interesting. Like, there has been a lot of talk about community opposition to data centers. And I think you hit the nail on the head about some of the things that are being, some of the concerns that are being raised. Water in particular, we could probably do a whole separate podcast episode about water usage at some point. But I do want to ask, at a high level, why is there so much concern about water usage from y'all's perspective? And Daniel, I know that you were waving around a study that UT did recently, and I'm curious kind of what were you gleaning from that? And I may have a couple other thoughts to add here.
That's right. What I was waving around was a recent study out of UT's University of Texas at Austin's Energy Institute, where they were looking at water use requirements for data centers in Texas. I don't know about Harris County, Jared, but Travis County here is still in a drought, right? We're coming out of a drought. Texas sort of sits on either side of the 98th meridian. One half of the state's pretty lush and green, and other parts very, very arid. And so, yeah, there are concerns at governmental levels about where the water's going to come from. Not just for data centers, by the way, just for our growing state. And so there's that part of it. One of the things we see with environmental laws, though, and Jason can speak to this as well, is that community members who are concerned about air emissions or water use or impacts to waterways through wastewater discharges will engage with their communities. They will oppose certain projects. And one of the ways to do that is to comment on or try to contest required permits. And so environmental permits can kind of become a proxy for a lot of different other community goals, whether it's maintaining the character of a community, which maybe isn't as pertinent in a brownfield, certainly would be pertinent in the greenfield. We see a lot of opposition to various projects that are going in and developing in a space that hasn't been used for industrial activity before. So there can be a lot of different motivations, but they do key in on environmental issues quite often.
And that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to see University of Texas, not Tennessee, hook 'em baby. University of Texas kind of studying the water issue, because there are certainly water constrained areas where, on this podcast, we've talked a lot about the opportunity that there is to site data centers in West Texas in particular, where there is not enough infrastructure takeaway capacity for the amount of natural gas that is produced in the Permian Basin in particular. But as many folks know, if anybody listening to this has been out to Midland, you'll know real quick, it's not the greenest place in the world. But there is a remarkable amount of water, believe it or not. It's just salty brine water that is produced alongside with oil and gas activities. And one of the things that has been interesting and that we are following closely and working with a couple of clients on is potential opportunities to use produced water for data center applications, cooling applications, or power generation. One example, if you think about it, if you're not familiar with the produced water in West Texas in the Permian, there is so much produced that it is becoming more and more expensive to dispose of that water. It is still being reused in hydraulic fracturing and, recycled and reused, but ultimately it's still re-injected. And so there are a few companies, a couple of which we are working with, that are working on desalination technologies that would be able to basically take the majority of that produced water and turn it into what they're hoping to be dischargeable water on the surface. And so you could use that for purposes of supplying water to a data center for cooling. Or in some circumstance, we've been hearing talk about, how can you actually utilize the produced water itself for treatment using waste heat from a data center. So there are so many kind of good opportunities for the two industries to collaborate in the Permian in particular. But I think we've already kind of
we gotta yeah, we're gonna have to pick this back up on maybe like a mini series of episodes, given how much we could riff on it.
I hope that the two industries find a way to turn those two challenges into a solution, because when hydraulic fracturing sort of first got its big momentum boost with the sort of combination of hydraulic fracturing and directional drilling, the same discussion happened about all of the need for water to do the fracking and then the produced water associated with it. And several people started to develop the technologies to treat the produced water to serve as to serve as part of the frac fluid. And ultimately, the abundance and price of both the supply of fresh water and the low cost of disposal made it not competitive for those folks to get into the sector. And so now you face both the produced water issue and the need for cooling capacity at the data centers, and it's a great opportunity to find a solution to that.
For sure.
Yeah, I'm very bullish on this because in addition to the sort of industrial focus that we've had in our conversation, right? How many hundreds of people are moving to Texas every day? How many companies are relocating here and setting up new manufacturing facilities, right? They're going to be, over the next 10 years, so many demands on our aquifers and on our water resources that I'm pretty optimistic.
Yeah.
We'll come revisit this podcast episode if I turn out to be totally wrong, but I'm very hopeful anyways about there being a lot of momentum towards figuring this out. It'd be awesome.
I'm a constant believer in the power of human ingenuity. So I agree with you, Daniel. Well, before we get off too off in the weeds, bringing us back to kind of Brownfield's environmental liability, something that we haven't talked about is like, who actually owns the liability? And if a developer decides to move forward, I mean, how do you deal with who's responsible for that liability? Is it the buyer? Is it the seller? How does that work in y'all's experience?
So going back to the level set, as a matter of environmental law, in the absence of having availed yourself of a Brownfield program, which you can do, as a matter of law, both the buyer and the seller are jointly and severally responsible for a release of hazardous substances that incurs response costs. That's the basic premise of Section 107 of CERCLA. A lot of parties contract that liability to one party or the other, the buyer or the seller, which is only as good as the future solvency of the indemnitor in that circumstance. Most Brownfield deals that I have seen thus far are transactions structured as asset sales because the incoming data center developer is not interested in procuring the legacy liabilities associated with the products and operations associated with whatever the industrial site did before they got there. And as a buyer seeking to insulate yourself from liabilities associated with the past, if you buy the entity, you're stepping into the shoes of the entity that was there before, and that entity has those liabilities. So you're not insulating yourself in that way. So usually they're asset sales. Usually the party exiting the site, I think in all circumstances that I can think of that I've seen, they're looking to deal with a legacy liability associated with a site that they've, that just is a liability on their books. And so their primary objective is to offload the legacy liability associated with the site. There is more and more a desire to maximize price because of what data center developers are willing to pay for land is going up and up. So, and they want to have some certainty associated with getting paid So the data center developer wants to pay something, but is willing to pay more once they have proven up a viable project and brought it online. The seller, cash is king. And so they want to see cash, or they want to see guarantees associated with the payments of those cash, out into, if the payments are out into the future. So there's a tension there, but that's what you're helping, your client to navigate, whether you're on the sell side of that or on the buy side of it, to figure out what's a fair place to strike that balance between the offloading of the liabilities, the certainty of the price, and then the certainty of the payment on that price, and then dealing with the CERCLA liability, like the boomerang risk. The seller doesn't want to see that boomerang back to them, but who is their indemnitor? Is it just a project specific entity that may or may not make it, or is it the parent of that entity? Can you use insurance or other tools to deal with those potential risks? Those are all some of the questions that you're going to face in a transaction to figure out who owns the risk associated with the legacy practices at the site. Man,
there's a lot to unpack in what you just said, Jason.
Yeah.
So
try to give the short answer, but that's a...
So I think maybe stepping back at a base level, if you are walking into a site without any other mitigation circumstances, and you operate at that site, you are jointly and severally liable. And in plain English, what that means is that you, as one company, are responsible for basically the entire liability on your own, regardless of whether or not everybody else who owned it in the past is bankrupt or still in existence. And if they are, maybe there is some shared liability, but at the end of the day, the government can go after one party and for the entire liability. Is that more or less right?
You're ready to be an environmental lawyer. Yes, that's more or less right.
The way I explain it is that, I've got 3 small kids. I hear the Superfund argument almost every day. My sister left that out. I don't have to clean that up. My sister left that out. But if the goal is to clean up the entire house before guests come over, then, everybody's got to grab it or.
Got it.
But you have a right of recovery against the other responsible parties, subject, and there has an equitable component to it under Section 113 of CERCLA. So that's important, that you do have a right of recovery, but it depends upon the viability of those and solvency of those other parties who have responsibility. Yeah.
So you were also talking about there's multiple different ways that you can kind of divide that liability, or contractually, assuming that you have a creditworthy counterparty on the other side. As part of the purchase agreement, you may have indemnities, as you were talking about, but then you were also talking about how you would want to match that up with the structure of the purchase price, it sounds like. And that is an interesting point, because at a brownfield site, relative to a greenfield site where you may be in a powered land transaction, you may be willing to pay X dollars upon energization of X percent of the facility or what have you, and you're kind of at the utility's whim. But at a brownfield site, all of those issues on the diligence that you guys were talking about, they all come into play. And so you may want to lock in the site so that you know that you've got that as your project, and you may be willing as a developer to put down some initial amount up front, but you don't want to go for the full couple $100,000 per potential megawatt until you know that you can actually build on enough of the site to be able to achieve kind of your target megawatts that make the project economic. Is that kind of fair way to think about it?
So yes, buildability, and then also very importantly, speed to power.
Right.
So if that brownfield site was an energy taker and they have a supply agreement that you can transfer to the data center developer, the price is absolutely going to go up and reflect that basically the energy supply agreement, not the land, right? It's the energy supply agreement that gives them the speed to power. And if you manage to transfer that, that's chocolate and peanut butter to a data center developer. That's a Reese's Pieces right there. Yeah.
Yeah. As you said at the beginning of this podcast, Jason, environmental, it goes a lot farther beyond just what kind of stuff is in my water.
Yeah.
All right. After you've kind of closed on a transaction, how do you manage ongoing risks? What kind of environmental obligations are you thinking about? What kind of restrictions are sticking around? I mean, is there ongoing testing requirements? I mean, how are you mitigating your risk on a go-forward basis after you've acquired one of these brownfield sites?
Well, for the brownfield aspects of the site, you're going to have some sort of management plan associated with the site that basically says, for the things that you know are there and are issues, these are the steps that you must take to avoid contributing to or exacerbating those conditions. And so you will have essentially covenants or a plan with the government that says that you'll do things a certain way in terms of if you remove soils, how you'll manage them, where you can stockpile things, what you'll do to address human exposure issues, and also what you would do if you discovered something that wasn't already known as part of your development of the site. So those are kind of the basic brownfield aspects of that, and you must do that to avoid losing the protections that you attained by entering into the brownfield program. And then separate from that, for any data center development site, like you're constantly managing, how do I get the permits and authorizations that are necessary to construct, operate, provide a fuel source to the data center site that I'm trying to build, because that is directly impacting my speed to power. If you're on a waterway and you're developing a brownfield, or you're developing a data center, you also have sort of all the wetlands issues, right? You have to determine where are the presence of those jurisdictional features and how do I position my rectangle so that I don't go into them. Avoidance is your first strategy. If I can't avoid them and I need to fill them in, what permit do I need from the Corps of Engineers, and how do I mitigate for the consequences of building in that wetland? Where can I purchase the credits to do that mitigation? Those are all relevant questions really for any data center development, but a lot of times the brownfield ones are on a waterway. And so you have some piece of shoreline that you've got to respect the jurisdictional wetlands that are associated with it.
To me, that sounds really complicated. But
it's not horribly complicated, but these are things you want to talk through before you close on the deal. Like, is this a manageable aspect of it? Will it slow us down? Is the seller going to impose any negative covenants on us to be sure that our redevelopment doesn't go into sensitive areas that we're willing to avoid? Because you don't want to be sort of over the barrel of having to breach a negative covenant, because then you're in a tough negotiation with a seller who sort of holds the cards. So, but you've got to get utilities in there. You have to route in utilities and you have to do trenching, and each of these are pieces of it. It's hard to build a data center. It's complicated, and you need a good consulting team, a good technical team. And you need to have some good project managers and set it up and interface with the lawyers efficiently, but in a way that helps them to spot issues for you kind of over the horizon. And then obviously to help you plan and implement your engagement with the governmental entities that are going to issue those permits, hopefully in a timely fashion. But it depends on the jurisdiction. Different jurisdictions take different views and have a different degree of alacrity towards data center development. So that also has to be taken into account.
What Jason said about permitting authorities and those considerations is just so crucial for that speed to power component. It's not something that you would think about necessarily if you were totally in the weeds or in the dirt on the diligence side, trying just to surface the contamination issues, which is why I think we prefer to have a holistic approach to project design and diligence. That's not just, we're looking at a brownfield, so we know we might have some historical liabilities here. What we try to do in environment, lands, and resources is not just understand the immediate legal request, but partner with a company in their pursuit of their goals, right? It's not just buying a piece of property that may have some attractive proximity to an industrial area. So what do you want to do with that site? What do you want to build? What are you going for? And when you focus on the client's goals, you see the relevant questions more thoroughly.
And part of holistic approach to me is you better have a plan for government and community engagement, right? You have to figure out how you explain yourself, how you talk about what it is that you're doing, how you set expectations. The politicians are going to decide which side of the fence they come down on. And so you're going to want to be engaged with the relevant people to be sure they understand what it is you're trying to do and what benefits you're going to provide to the community. And that's a challenge, but it's not just a legal question, right? It's not just how do I get these permits? Like, I need a social license to operate in this community. How am I going to attain that? How am I going to explain the development process, the permits that are being obtained? How will it impact the local economy? What sort of jobs are going to come from it? What drain on resources, natural resources will there be? What will the impact be? I mean, affordability is the coin of the realm right now in Washington, D.C. So you better have an explanation for how does this affect the cost of living for people in the community? It's just a fundamental question, and people are going to ask it, and politicians are going to want to know how to answer those questions if they're going to come down in support of the site.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things too is sometimes you'll see incongruous comments from at a national level, coming from the CEO of a company that is maybe developing their own data centers or leasing capacity in them. And then if that message is inconsistent with the message that you're trying to deliver to the community, whether it's affordability or natural resources usage, when you talk about the actual facts on the ground, you got to make sure that there's some consistency among all levels of your communication strategy.
Very true.
To kind of get close to wrapping this conversation up, I think this has been a really interesting conversation or discussion about all of the things that you want to think about on the brownfield development. We went on a couple of tangents here and there, but one of the questions I'm curious about is what should developers be watching from a policy standpoint? Are there things coming down the pike? Are you hearing things that would be from the EPA or from the administration that would either maybe make some of the community opposition a little less relevant, or what are you guys seeing from an environmental policy standpoint in response to some of this community activism?
Well, there's certainly the administration is leaning into data center development through executive orders, through a couple of different EPA policies. I think those are all some wind at the back of data center development, and permit reform is obviously front and center here in Washington. Lost a little momentum here in the first quarter of 2026, but I think we'll get back on the docket of Congress. We'll see. But data centers are local, and there's only so much at the federal level that can be done to facilitate the development. You have to have support at the state and local level, and so you're really going to see. I think it's PJM and ERCOT where the greatest amount of data center development is sort of in the queue, if you will. By far, right? And so you're going to have to watch. If I'm a data center developer, I'm watching what's happening at the state and local levels in those RTOs, right? To determine where is the wind sufficiently at my back to get to speed to power, right? Yeah. That's a fundamental question, I think, is doesn't really matter. You're not trying to be close to your customers, right? It's not a location sort of business. It's location in terms of where can I get the inputs and where can I, and outputs that my facility needs. And then I just need a flat spot where I can put my rectangle. So yeah, I think you really need to watch the state and local programs and read the tea leaves of where the politicians are and where the communities are to understand where are the opportunities. Northern Virginia has been a center for data center development. It's really interesting how it's affected the DMV area here in Washington.
Yeah. The next Texas legislative session is going to be pretty big for data centers. That's already been one of the interim charges to the legislature to examine what kind of impact both on ERCOT and on Texas water this next build out of data centers is going to bring. And that's really focused, I think, more on resources usage. At the same time, if I check my Instagram, I have AI prompting me to look at grassroots organizers who are all throughout Texas who are gearing up for that legislative session as well. I learned a song that just sticks in my head. You can't spell Abilene without AI. Somebody recorded that song and put it on Instagram. And there's a lot happening in Texas. You've got to pay attention to what's happening with the ledge, the PUC and TCEQ. And maybe, Jared, we'll have to have a Texas-sized podcast.
To close us out, if you were going to leave our listeners here with one thing to think about, or one misconception that you'd rather folks not be about brownfield development or about environmental law and how that affects data center development or how important it is, what's the kind of one takeaway that each of you guys would leave our listeners here?
On brownfield development, I think there's huge opportunity for data centers. It is a solution to a problem, and the brownfield program was designed to facilitate it. And my other takeaway would be is grow up to be a data center nerd like Jared, because this is happening, and it's going to be an amazing area of the economy for years to come, and understanding it like you do and thinking about it from the different perspectives is really helpful to, figuring out how this fits into the social fabric of the United States and of the world. But there's a race for this, and it's on. And America is figuring out how to, be competitive in that race. And we do have a lot of abundant and reliable electricity, and we know how to build stuff quick. And so we're going to try to take advantage of that in the data center space. And I look forward to kind of watching that.
I think something I said at the beginning, that each brownfield site is unique. If you go looking, you really might find something that is fit for purpose for a project that you're thinking about. And so I would encourage people to consider brownfields as a siting opportunity and to leverage some of, again, it's going to be very site specific, but there could be very real advantages out there, and you may end up finding a diamond in the rough.
I love it. Well, thanks again, guys. Really appreciate your time. And to everybody listening, really appreciate you guys joining us for another episode of the Data Center Counsel podcast. We'll catch you next time.
That's it for us today at the Environmental Law Monitor. Big thanks to our guests and the rest of our production team who helped to make this episode possible. And of course, thank you, our listeners, and we'll talk to you soon.